So that's when you wait for your friends. We can start a new row, or we can we'll have to start a new row, I guess. If we get any more, I'll start a new row.
Do you want me to
Here.
scoop you there?
No, because nobody else might come and you would miss out on these. I'll put them wherever. But I'm going to just sit back here now. Ladies, this is big. But one night, We're going to start a row behind Marie. Over here. Marie, will you get Zoe?
Okay. Just go around to the side here. Okay.
We had a good turnout today.
Do you tell her she can come back out and get me in the room?
Good afternoon. I'm Glenn. Hope you're all doing well. I'm Lynn Weisberg, and I am a member of the Linwood Foundation Board of Directors, or just a member, and a member of the History Committee. Welcome to the Rosalie Reynolds Explore History Series. This is our annual Veterans Day presentation. And so we would like to recognize all the veterans who are here with us today. So would you, if you wish, please stand or raise your hand so that we can recognize. We all thank you for your service. Okay, so once again, we are sold out, as you can see. I'd like to welcome those of you who are streaming live on YouTube TV. Isn't that exciting? We have YouTube TV streaming. All right, so as always, we offer a special thank you to our partner and presenting sponsor, Wells Fargo Private Bank. Our other long-standing partnerships include the North Carolina chapter of the Institute for Classical Architecture and Art, and of course, the Duke Mansion. We deeply appreciate your ongoing support over these many years. So while Trick or Treat is officially behind us, we still have some treats in store for you today. Meredith Ritchie, the author of Poster Girls, is here to share a story of Charlotte's World War II and wartime efforts. The women who worked at the Naval Munitions Plant located in the Still Creek area. And we also happen to have another author in the house to moderate today's lecture, our own Dr. Tom Hanchett, Charlotte's master historian and author of Sorting Out the New South City, Race, Class, and Urban Development in Charlotte, 1875 to 1975. Be sure to check out Tom's website, www.historysouth.org. And I guarantee you, once you go on that website, you'll still be sitting there reading 4 hours later. Tom's book is available at Parkroad Books, and Meredith's book is on site here for sale today. She has one hardcover, I think, for $29.95, and lots of soft covers for you at $16.95. So right at that table outside the door, you can buy a wonderful book, a wonderful story. So before we turn the program over to Meredith and Tom, we have another treat for you. So you may have heard the Linwood Foundation, which is the umbrella organization for the Duke Mansion and the Lee Institute, has a new CEO. Peter Blair joined the Linwood Foundation this April and spent the first 90 days learning and listening. And he's here, hopefully, to say just a few words to you. This is his maiden voyage as the district mayor. We're so happy to have him. So would you please welcome our new CEO, Peter Blair.
Thank you, Meredith, and welcome everyone to the Duke Mansion. We are thrilled to have you here today in what is mostly a standing room only event. So for those of you who aren't seated yet, we'll be sure to get you seated just shortly. As Linda mentioned, I joined the organization of the Linwood Foundation as president and CEO a little over 6 months ago, and I'm delighted to see the breadth and depth of programming that we have, and I'm delighted to be with you here today to enjoy the history lecture. We have with us the foremost historian in Charlotte, Dr. Tom Hanchett. And so if you're introducing Tom, the challenge is to find something that hasn't been said about Tom, because it pretty much has all been said. But I did find two things that you may not have heard that were definitely my favorite descriptions of Tom and what Dr. Hanchett brings to our wonderful city. The first described him as bespectacled, lasered, and bearded. I appreciate that one more than any other. So he is there. Soon, maybe we'll get him to be bedazzled, and then we can add a fourth B to that. But the thing that I like the most of what I read that has been written about Tom is that Tom is a master storyteller. And one of the things that a masterful storyteller does is they know the power of the story, and the storyteller knows that what's left out of the story can sometimes be as illuminating as what is told in the story. So today, again, we have Dr. Tom Hanchett with us. He's been educated at Cornell University, the University of Chicago, and our favorite down here, the University of North Carolina. His writings range from urban history to the history of shopping malls, and today he is going to illuminate us with yet more. Dr. Hanchett.
Thank you, Peter Blair. Can y'all hear me? This thing working? That's good. Wonderful. It is such a pleasure to be here. And one of the things we always do, in addition to talking about Poster Girls, is to talk about the book about Myers Park that the Duke Mansion put out a new edition of a few years back. And this is for sale at the main desk out there. And golly, as long as I got the microphone, there is Sorting Out the New South City, the book I wrote. But I want to tell you about that in order to tell you about this, Edible, North Carolina. This is a food history book, food culture today. The editor, Marcy Cohen Ferris, is one of the most distinguished food historians in the world. And she is at Chapel Hill, and she said we need a North Carolina food update. And so some of you are fans of Kathleen Purvis for many years at the Charlotte Observer. Some of you know Kia Mastriani, who is a farmer and pie baker out of the Shelby area, who's done a lot of work in Charlotte. We're all going to be at Park Road Books next Saturday, 2 o'clock, to do nice things around edible North Carolina. So what we're going to do today, is go look at, metaphorically, the area that's now the Arrowwood Industrial Park. Go down to Arrowwood Road, Westinghouse Boulevard, there's a whole lot of big old warehouses. And when I came to Charlotte in 1981, that was way out past the edge of town. And there wasn't much out there. It was kind of big, expansive, nothing with kind of bumps in it. And somebody said, those bumps are bunkers from when the Navy used to make shells out here. And I'm not a military historian, and I was thinking shells, Navy. And fortunately, David Erdman is here. David, would you stand up for just a moment?
Here.
David Erdman has one of the shells that's actually made at the Navy shell. Isn't that cool? And many of you got to see that close up earlier on. He's going to have to slip out to another meeting, but hey, thank you so much for bringing it in here. But what we're going to do is have Meredith Ritchie share some stories about the novel that she crafted. She spent time with people who had been part of that story. Often military history is told from pretty much a male perspective. And the cool thing about the shell plant is it employed women. And, well, she'll tell you more cool stuff beyond that. But I knew one of those people, Marilyn Beecham Price, who passed away a couple of weeks ago. And she, when she was a young girl, according to Jim Price, she would take the bus from the Woodlawn community, which used to be a rural farm community on Woodlawn Road, if you can imagine that, out to work in the shell plant. And one of the wonderful things, I never got to talk with her as much as I wanted to, but Meredith did. And so what we're going to enjoy, I think, is a way of using fiction to get at the truth. Thank you for doing that. Truth that she's told me recently, she is a native Charlottean. Do we have any other native Charlotteans in the house? Woo! Round of applause. Yes. And she was born at Mercy Hospital when that was the Catholic hospital. And if you've delved into this book a little bit, one of the main characters is a Catholic in the South, which used to be much rarer than it is now. And so that's one of the pieces of the story as well. So if you would, make welcome Meredith Fidel.
Thank you so much, Tom, for that wonderful introduction and for lighting a passion for all of us for the history of Charlotte. So I'm so glad to see all these people in this room and know that I am not alone in people who love Charlotte's very rich history. And I'm here to tell you what I learned about the city that I was born in. So, all right, so I'm going to talk about some World War II Charlotte sheroes, if I can borrow that easy term that everyone uses for everything. She said sheroes. But before we do that, we're going to take a step back, okay? So I'm going to have you close your eyes, and I'm going to read something that I want you to picture. Take a trip back to 1943. You drive home from your job at the shell plant. Your precious tires roll over dirt until they finally cross onto the paved city limit roadways. You keep the speedometer under 35, the newly posted victory speed limit. Better to conserve fuel. To conserve everything these days. You roll to a stop, allowing a command of soldiers in training cross the road in neat rows, young faces, and so serious. You wait through their march, lifting your eyes to the darkening Carolina blue sky, hoping to make it home before dark, when headlights are discouraged. Who knew how far the latest German attack planes could fly? After Pearl Harbor, America was through underestimating the enemy. Getting closer to home, you pass many windows displaying their banners, most with blue stars in the center. Some stars are gold, and you hold your breath past those, hoping to avoid such a sad fate. You pass the evening postman, leaving your front stoop, his heavy bag full of letters and hope. You park and hope he rang the bell twice this time, a letter from him. The last connection across the infinite number of miles. You scoop the evening news off your porch. Its headline warns of Nazi U-boats hidden for months, waiting off the coast of Cape Hatteras. No place is safe. You send up a fast prayer for a faster end to this nightmare. As you squeeze your front door handle, almost safe at home, your new neighbor waves in your direction. The one with the slight accent. You let your hand fall quickly. You could be a spy. Anyone could. So I read that because what I learned in researching Charlotte in World War II was that we tend to peanut butter history, right? We write, or we think, oh, everyone knew that the war was going to last 3.5 years, and everyone knew we were going to win. And everyone, I guess this is my small mind, the way I thought about it. But in realizing this, there were so many unknowns, and Charlotte was a really scary place. But DC liked where Charlotte was, and the Navy liked where Charlotte was, because it was East Coast, but it was not right on the East Coast. So we still had to have blackout curtains, et cetera, because again, you did not know what the latest German technology would bring us. But so they liked it because it was a little more safe than some of the truly coastal cities. But it was close, and it was close to miles of railroad tracks, and there were a lot of things that really attracted Charlotte. So in writing this book, I learned that a large set of those from the Charlotte Chamber of Commerce and U.S. Rubber Company, which became Continental Tire, went up to DC and they met with the U.S. Navy and they formed a partnership. And Charlotte was no different in that there were military corporate partnerships being formed all over the country. So that's another sort of peanut butter approach, because when I think of Rosie the Riveter, I always picture California, and I picture them on planes. And I think that's because there were the most maybe pictures that are available, and maybe my own history books that I read. And so that was my idea of what a Rosie the Riveter was. So, and that's up at the top left, or top right corner. But underneath that were, and that's not the actual shell plant. Underneath it, there are no pictures. That's the other thing. People didn't talk about what they did. There was one brochure that I found in the Carolina room at the main library that the U.S. Rubber Company did publish to display the technology and the things, how things were laid out. I used that was my main resource for how the plant was structured, but that's all that was there. And so in terms of what I can find. And but that's something that the plant or the assembly line would have looked like. So we didn't build anything, or we didn't make anything. There was no steel casting. It was all assembly. So those miles of railroad tracks that went into that Steel Creek plant, it brought the parts. And all these women, mostly women, up to 90% women at some point, would just assemble them together. And they filled them with gunpowder. So the air smelled like gunpowder. It was a very dangerous thing. And they did it every day, up to 10,000 of them at its peak. So if you have a chance, you would like to see from the map store, I miss it off River or Moorhead. This is Charlotte in 1942, and it's when our census just went over 6 figures. So we had 100,899 people here in 1942. And 10,000 of them worked at the plant. So that's a pretty big number. So Charlotte's war history, it was prominent. So employ the 10%. It was dangerous. It was important. One thing that I didn't watch many World War II movies or war movies, but when I must have seen something, because I definitely have an image of a naval officer in the Bofors guns, which David Urban taught me about. I wrote an article for Myers Park Living, and he saw that, and he called me and said, "Do you know what you're writing about?" I said, "I think you can help me with that." So he told me all about Bofors guns, and I realized that was what I had envisioned. And it's ones that had the steering wheel on them, and it would go 360 degrees. And so they sat on ships, and they were meant to protect the ships from incoming planes and also other ships. So that's what Charlotte made, and it made it really, really well. So in our quality checks that we did in Watery Pond, South Carolina, so it was way south of here, but it tested them, and they tested really well, and the quality checks were very much a proud point in our prominence, with DC, and they started modeling some of the other plants off of what we were doing. So that was really fun. So that was decorated for safety. It received the E flag of excellence 3 times. And so all these things I kind of put into the book, but I wanted you to know that these things really happen. So posters. I got to name my book, which is not always the case. And so I had some really bad titles. And the progression of those bad titles is, I'll keep that secret. But I had so many different titles that were interesting to me, in words that I wrote on 2 pages in the book. And I ended up taking all those words individually and writing them on an index card. And then I laid them out all over the floor, I guess. And I just started letting the words kind of float up. And I would pick the word of interest, and I'd put all the other ones with it. And so Poster Girls really spoke to me because, posters are an example of how we want to be. Posters were the way that propaganda and behavior change was definitely, this was sort of our social media of 1940, mid-1940s. And some of them were really scary. So I love the one on the left, United We Win. There was a big push because there was an enormous labor shortage. So it was this very brief equity period in Charlotte. So United We Win, we can work side by side. Please come and work in the plants. The middle one is Someone Talked. So when I did go speak to Marilyn Leach-Price, who was so dear, she talked about not knowing as much necessarily from her mother because they were trained not to talk about it. There was something called loose lips sink ships. And you paid attention to that. And you really, especially with these scary posters, you realized that people could die from you talking about it among the friends. And then car sharing is a must. That was the very first chapter that I wrote, was the carpool chapter. That was really fun. But fill those empty seats because everything is scarce. So there was a wartime labor shortage. So this is interesting for some 25 years later or close to it, when the Civil Rights Bill was passed in 1964. So this is Franklin Delano Roosevelt put an executive order out in 1941, and that was before we entered the war. But you have to know that everyone at that point, they were getting ready for maybe having to enter the war. So they did. We did write this executive order, and it basically is called the Fair Employment Practice into the Defense Industry only. So it was the government's answer to the labor shortage. Okay. So if you ever watched the movie Hidden Figures or read the book Hidden Figures, it's great. That's what allowed those women to work in Mexico. So and they got paid the same and with several equities involved. And so that also brought into play the double V. So you can see African Americans holding up two victory symbols, and that was victory abroad and victory at home. So this was a war that they were participated in, and it felt like it was going to give them some leverage to really work for their rights here at home. And I never addressed that in the book, but I kind of let the reader come to their own terms with that. So the tree kind of snapped back a little. So here's some historical facts. So this plant, and I truly stumbled upon it. I was telling someone earlier, well, how did you pick this setting? And I didn't know this setting even existed. So I decided to, I knew I wanted to write a novel. I have triplets, and they were born in 2000, so this was 2018. They were getting ready to go off to college, and I knew I needed to stretch. So I wanted to learn something new. I'm a lifelong learner. I love to learn new things. So I've always been a good business writer. I decided I want to learn how to write historical fiction. It's my favorite all-time job. So I knew I wanted to be about Charlotte, because they always say write what you know. And I knew that it needed to be in World War II because I needed the men to be gone. No offense to the wonderful men in the room, but they sometimes, when you're talking about women's leadership styles, it can be confused when the men are in the room. So that was, I knew that was my setting, and I actually thought that that something in Camp North End, which had just kind of become a thing back then, was going to be my setting. And so I started researching that area, which is one of the coolest areas in Charlotte, and amazing history, but it was kind of boring in World War II. So it just shipped out supplies and only employed about 800 people during that time period. Again, I had to have it, in these 2.5 years. So as Googling, I love to Google, as I'm Googling, plant, Charlotte, World War II, the shell plant kept coming back in my search. And I was like, what is this thing? I did not know. And so I dove in, and it became the perfect setting for my novel. So I did not know about it to begin with, which is great. And it's 2,200 acres. So you could literally fit 6 Carowinds inside the footprint of this thing. It was enormous. Over 250 buildings that were built in less than 6 months' time. And this was the war machine, right? They were doing amazing things in such a short period of time. But the buildings really weren't built to last, right? There was a shortage of steel, so they were all smaller buildings. Plus, if you're dealing with that much gunpowder, you really don't want a large building. You kind of want to isolate things in case there is a fire, which there was at the plant. And that was written into the story as well. And so, but it employed over 10,000 and it operated 3 shifts, 24/7. So it was an enormous facility. Then the lines assembled those shells that David Irving so thankfully showed everyone. They were huge. And then nearly 90% of them were women, and many were people of color. And it pulled workers from 5 rural counties. And it's a massive bus network. So, it's funny, I hear some of the recent local political issues about our bus network. I'm like, no, we did this before. We assembled a massive bus network that, supplied the labor for this plant. So it's kind of interesting. And then the opportunity was pretty drastic for people of color, especially women of color. So they had the opportunity to go from making about $3 a week in a white woman's home to making $27 to $30 a week at the plant. And again, because the executive order was in place, there was no wage discrimination. They all started at the same wage. There was no, they all sat wherever they wanted to on the bus. And there's a book called The Queen City of War that I used as a reference quite a bit, that said, they all because of those things, they actually all kind of got along. So that's definitely an influence as well. I believe in that part of it, not just peanut butter history. So some people push back and like, would Cora and Maggie really have been that close of friends? And I was like, tell me they weren't. All right. So it was Charlotte's largest employer until one day it wasn't. So the picture on the left, these are both, not from Pinterest, other ones from Pinterest. The one on the left, that was the actual administrative building, as it looked. That was the largest building that was there. So that would have housed all the Navy folks that were brought to run the plant, as well as U.S. Rubber Company. So the Navy invested all the assets and the land and the buildings. And of course, they owned it when it was done. And then U.S. Rubber Company provided the labor. They managed the labor resources. So if I counted, there's like 14 rows of windows on the right, 14 rows of windows on the left, and it almost goes back 14 deep. So this was an enormous, enormous building. But that is the actual administrative building of the plant, and it no longer exists. And then the picture on the right is the day that the Japanese surrendered. By 2:30 in the afternoon, they were all fired and told to go. So this I'm going to talk about. Well, I think Tom's going to ask me some questions about Marilyn Meacham Price a little later. But this is also a woman that is currently 105. Her name is Bess Alice Hambright Pfeiffer, and I did not know her. She was not in my sphere at the time. But when I produced the book, her daughter reached out to me and said, "My mother worked there," and I was like, "Oh my gosh, I must talk to her." So I went and I met with her. She currently lives in an independent living facility in Kings Mountain, where she moved, I don't know, 2 years ago. Like, she's just amazing. The only thing is she can't hear as well, so she did not want to be here today, but she does know that I'm saying this about her, but she's great. So she worked at the Shell plant in the summertime of 1943. And so this would have been her summer job. She was probably about 25 years old at the time. And then she got offered a job with the Red Cross. So that was another way for women to serve. And so the Red Cross actually took her to Hawaii and Guam for the remainder of the war. So she lived on the islands, which I thought was so cool. So that is her in front of the, what did Tom call it? Quonset huts, yes. In front of one of the Quonset huts in Guam. And then the bottom left is the group of the Red Cross. They're kind of like a welcoming committee for the soldiers when they were on like a 5-day leave and they would go to the either Hawaii or Guam. So they were responsible for making sure they were playing tennis and going to dances and that kind of thing. They were event coordinators, put it that way. That's her on the right, and that's me with her, meeting her, and that was probably in March of this year, so a couple months after the book. And she just turned, in October, she turned 105, so she's amazing. And this is my favorite. So as I was walking, her daughter picked me up, and we went to her living facility, and we passed by, they have this wall of honor at the facility that she lives in. And I was like, look, that's her. And they're like, yes, she's the only woman with all the men that were veterans of World War II. So I love that. The only problem with that is she was not around at the plant when the fire broke out. And she was not around for the 3rd anniversary of Pearl Harbor. So she couldn't really talk to that part of it, which are main turning points in the story. But it was so great to speak with her. She confirmed a lot of things. She confirmed, it was a lot of blue that they had to wear, and steel-toed shoes, and it was really fun. So the pictures, that was sort of the pictures that are shown in black and white. But in my humble opinion, storytelling is what adds the color. So Yeah, so I invented Cora, I invented Maggie, Billy, Nell, Lee, and Deborah. And I know the story that they would have all kind of been outsiders-ish to Charlotte, and getting ingrained and trying to figure out their way in these very uncertain times. Because I was never a great history student. This is ironic because I wrote a historical fiction novel, but the dates and the places and times, you know, I memorized those for the test, and then they would just stick in my brain. So, but coming to love historical fiction, I always say that a really good historical fiction novel will have me up at 2 o'clock in the morning, Googling something, like, did this really happen? And so I've done that with many books, and a couple people have told me they did it with mine, which I consider the highest compliment. So yeah, I'm here to tell you today what was real and what might have been a little bit made up. And but I think the feelings and the empathy that we can have for all the different circumstances in some of those characters is the power of historical fiction. So that is the end of my presentation, and I would love to take any questions. I would say in the hardcover version, which I apologize for not having more of, there is inside flap that does say true facts from the Queen City. So I will leave this up here for anyone to read, and then the map is also here of 1942.
I will run around with the microphone if folks have questions or comments. First thing, is there anyone here who has personal connections to this story? Somebody in your family worked at the Shell plant, you have other knowledge that way, or you worked in a family member worked in a similar facility someplace else. Would you be willing to say a word about your family?
Certainly, I don't have a lot to say. I was hoping to learn more today than I can tell you, but both of my grandmothers worked in the Shell factories here in Charlotte.
What did they go on to do?
One grandmother went on to work in a company called Packaged Products for the rest of her career, and then founded a babysitting agency when she retired. And the other grandmother worked for that period of time and was a homemaker.
Before we lose David Earth, Dan, say a word here.
Yeah, the reason thank you very much, thank you very much. The reason I have this shell is because my father-in-law, we were at Thanksgiving about 20 years ago, and I was telling him about the Shell plant. He said, well, I worked at the Shell plant. And I said, my goodness, what was that about? He said, well, I have a shell. And sure enough, he had a shell. And so his occasion to work at the Shell plant was that he had grown up in Shelby, born in 1924, and he was a student at NC State working in the summer at the Shell plant. And they gave everybody who worked there, apparently, a shell to take home. So they made a few of these other things. There's no explosive. By the way, he asked me to comment on the fact that the hole in it is let me tell you a little bit more. This is a 40 millimeter shell. You mind, Meredith?
No.
Okay, so the Bofors guns, which you can see all over the battleship North Carolina, were the defense mechanism for all the surface ships, including PT boats, that the U.S. Navy had. And the Bofors guns took racks of 4 of these shells at a time and put them in the weapons, which were sometimes called pop guns. They went back and forth like this. And yes, if you've ever been on the battleship as a kid, as I was, you can swing around but this weapon, I was speculating, these are anti-aircraft shells. This is not to shoot other ships. This is to shoot airplanes out of the sky. And they're not talking about airplanes that are way up there. They're talking about airplanes that are dive bombing on them to try to sink the ship. And so it's my guess that every 1,000 of these were fired. They were fired almost as fast as you can imagine machine guns firing. They're not machine guns. They had to load them individually 4 shots at a time. But they were firing very, very fast. I figure no more than one shell in 1,000 actually hit the target. Because if you've ever seen World War II films, you've seen the tracers, showing where the bullets were going, what's in the shell. And, man, if they hit one, they could bring the plane down. But they were firing for their dear life. And you know, it is written, I know Meredith knows this, that a battleship they had so many Bofors guns on them that they could shoot 500,000 of these shells in an hour.
Thank you, David. Now, there was a hand over here. There was a person with a question or a comment?
Basically, is there any landmark left of the shell factory?
Yeah, I think the bombs are gone. The bunkers.
The monks are gone. The only building left is a Mexican restaurant on Westinghouse, and it was the main cafeteria. So the main cafeteria, which is prominently featured in the book, was built. It was the only place they could smoke until it caught fire. It was the only place they could smoke. It was built 200 feet away from every other building. So it's the only one that's there. It's right at Westinghouse and near the intersection of Westinghouse and Tryon. And it's called Las Poblanitas, I believe. And it's a very good Mexican restaurant. It's actually where I signed my contract. It was great. It was really fun, yeah. That's the only one that, I don't think, I've tried to tell them, like, do you know what this is? They don't hear.
That was my question, but what was the next
Oh. Las Poblanitas.
La Poblanita, the little pepper
Yes.
thing, yes. And I haven't been there in several years, but it was the best place. It has its own candy store.
It does, yeah.
Dulceria.
Yeah.
And so we're not doing anything right afterwards. That's two hands up this way. And hang on a second, let me get to you.
So how do they fill these canisters, shells?
Well, if you had a chance to hold Davis, he doesn't like people holding it, but it's okay. They're very heavy, and then so they would fill. I can only imagine how heavy it was filled with gunpowder as well. Is empty, but it was. I mean, I'm not sure it's the exact stage that it was filled with gunpowder, but there was a tracer line, like you said. There was a fuse line. And so it really would kind of go the full gamut of here's the different parts, and then here's what has the different components. And when the women were assigned to a certain line, it would be one of those things, tracer line, fuse line, and I imagine there was also where they actually filled it with gunpowder and capped it, and it went on for testing the lottery pond. So yeah. So it was different than, say, if you ever read The Girls of Atomic City, which is also a great book.
Yep.
Those women did not know anything what they were doing. They had such a small, everyone's roles, I guess, were so diversified. They just knew they went and did one thing, and they didn't know the whole picture, which obviously we know why. But this plant was a little bit different. I mean, knew what they were doing.
Also, can you tell me a little bit more about the fire and connection with the rubber plant? Was the rubber plant converted into this plant?
No, it was never a rubber plant. It's just the U.S. Rubber Company went into partnership with the U.S. Navy to manage the labor. So the Navy Navy knew how to manage military folks. They did not know how to manage civilians. So.
Hi, I guess I've got two questions. One is following up on the idea that 500,000 could be shot in an hour. Like, how many were made in an hour at this plant? Like, what was the production throughput?
Oh, well, I can give you a very pinpoint the number of how many they produced on the 3rd anniversary of Pearl Harbor. So on December the 7th, 1944, so the plant would have been, I think it started production in January of 43. So it would have been almost 2 years old at that point. And they produced the most number of shells in a 24-hour period that they've done. So that was the maximum. It was 213,000 and some change. So that was the max, and that was, but it could have been, if you take the average, maybe 80% of that and multiply that times the number of days, that's like.
And then one quick question. So I know the Girls of Atomic City, that book has actually been, what's the word, under contract for a potential movie. I was just wondering, has anything like that come about for you? Like maybe there might be the movie Ocean Girls.
That is a very kind question.
Well, I think it'd be great.
Well, it really is, publishing a book is it's like winning the lottery. It wasn't the Powerball, like over $1 million, yeah, and no one's won it, so it is, there are some great odds going against any kind of authors, and so for it to get recognition as a movie would be like me winning the Powerball, but I can still win the Powerball. If you know anybody, let me know.
And we've got a question here in the back.
Well, actually, not a question,
Question.
but something about women in the Army. A few years ago, my Aunt Christine Williams, she rode a medical parade this past year. She would have been 100 now. She died earlier. She rode in the parade because she was the last woman living in this area in the WAC unit, which was the Women's Army Corps. I was just reading, created as an auxiliary unit in 42, became active status in 43, and then in 78 was disbanded when the male and female were integrated into the Army.
And that reminds me of a story that was at Levine Museum of the New South. A woman named Dovey Johnson, who was from Charlotte, African-American woman, eventually a distinguished civil rights attorney out of Washington, D.C., was one of the first African-American women in the WACs, the Women's Army Air Corps. And it's a precedent for the cross-racial thing that's in your story as well.
I was just wondering, all those people got there walking back at 2:30 and the plant was shut down. What happened to the facility and how long did it take for them to sit there and,
It did, for the next about 15 years. It was a Navy storage place. It was a Navy, and like I said, Charlotte was not unique. These factories were built, well, like Detroit probably would have converted its auto plants to build tanks, that kind of thing. So some of them went back to producing more consumer or commercial goods. But Charlotte's, it went back to the Navy, and it sat pretty empty for about 15 years. And then it started being, the city had to find out, the Navy gave it back to the city, and the city converted it into the Westinghouse industrial complex it is today. If you know where Siemens, that's the biggest plant that's there, so.
well, that same thing happened at Camp North End. Did it just sit?
And she's saying that Camp North End had a similar sort of exit out of being a military spot.
So Camp North End's history is so interesting. It just wasn't interesting at the time that I needed it to be. So it started out as a Ford plant, and actually a very famous architect built that. And it's a testament to how pristine it still looks. Those windows are still original windows that were put in there almost 100 years ago. So it was a Ford plant. They built the Model Ts. Then in World War II, again, like I said, they shipped out supplies. It's called the Quartermaster's Depot. And then at the end of World War II, which I didn't realize this either, so men were still getting drafted even after the war because they had to go and find the bodies. They had to bring home the soldiers. And so it still makes me tear up. So identify the remains and bring them back to the families. That Ford plant, Camp North End, was responsible for repatriating the dead. So all the Charlotte soldiers came back to that place. And then in the 50s, it built Nike bombs, which were nuclear bombs. And that is why it's called the bomb plant.
Just one more thing, if you've never done a tour of Camp North End, you can do that. Once a week, they have a free tour. You get to go in the old boiler room, and there's some moss in there that's unique just to North Carolina. They were gonna dig it up because it was, dirty looking. The environmentalists came out and said, no, you can't touch that moss, leave it there. So if you've never done the tour of Campbell, I would really encourage you to do it.
I think they have a tank on display too. It's a neat, yeah, I think they have a tank on display
Yeah,
there as well, yeah.
Anybody else?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Do these women get severance pay? Because most of us aren't.
Absolutely no severance.
I don't even follow what happens to women that are dependent on that money for.
Mostly I talk to daughters, whose mothers work there, and the common thread in those conversations was, and even parents, their fathers that served over there, is they did not want to talk about it. So what happened, I can only imagine what happened in the Pacific Theater, and just was, and I kind of wrote that at the end of the book. So they were just happy to be home and to move on with their lives. And so they said, so a lot of the women wouldn't really talk about it either, because I think they were just so trained not to talk about it. So they just wanted to move on.
Yes.
Talk about Meredith, I think, this speaks to that in a really nice way, the way you decided on the cover there and sort of that transition from work to.
Yeah, so I do love this city, I really do. I was born here, and in trying to find a publisher, I became very stubborn. Like, why should I have to go to New York to find a publisher? Because there's ones here. So I ended up getting a local publisher, so it's locally for an author, local publisher, and I found a local artist that would do the artwork. So her name is Eva Crawford, and she's wonderful. And I told her, what I wanted. This is an original watercolor that she drew. But I said I need it, basically describing the final one of the final scenes was for the billboard. So I made up. I have no idea if it was really a billboard, but I made up. There was a billboard, propaganda billboard that was showing, come on, women, you can do it. You're strong. You do to do this, and so they did. And then that billboard came down right afterwards, and it was replaced by a lovely black mom. So those are the messages, and there are very mixed messages that the women were getting. So I wanted to make that clear, and I think I did. So.
I love that. If I could ask a personal question, do you have memories of sitting down with Marilyn Meacham Price? Were you able to do that? I know that I pointed her to you, but
Yes,
I don't know
it did.
whether it took or not.
It did, yes. We had a great conversation. I probably spent half a day with Marilyn. And Marilyn has such a rich history with the folk music scene in Charlotte, and she and her husband just seemed like they were involved in everything. So I got to hear a lot about that, and she's the one who told me about now it's like the neighborhood. You said it earlier. Not Moorhead. What was it? Woodlawn. The Woodlawn neighborhood, yes. And that's not listed on there, but she said that was a neighborhood. And so I said, well, tell me more about those streets. What did they look like? Who was there? Who was playing in those streets? And she would tell me about that. She was the one who said, they had to wear blue, they had to wear the steel-toe shoes. This was also confirmed. But yeah, it definitely echoed the not knowing where, they were really going and not wanting to talk about it. And being very nervous about who you spoke to in Charlotte. So, which I thought was an interesting aspect. I didn't really write too much of that, like being worried about spies. But since then, I learned that actually was a real thing. And she also introduced me to a woman named Helen. And I spoke to her, her last name. She's in the acknowledgements, and I spoke to her as well.
Thank you. Anybody else? Yes.
So this was actually privately owned plant with a contract with the government?
No, the Navy, I imagine, so this isn't written anywhere, so I can't confirm this. which is a blessing and a curse, right, for historical fiction authors. So I get to make up what I can't find. But I did try to find how the land was obtained. So I imagine it was probably eminent domain, which was not uncommon at the time. So the government came in and bought the farmland. It was all farmland. Came and bought the farmland and then raised 250 buildings in that farmland in 6 months' time. So they built the assets, and then the U.S. Rubber Company, they didn't have a facility there. It was all the Navy's facility. So the Navy owned the buildings and owned the shells, and then the U.S. Rubber Company just came and managed the people.
So, did they provide uniforms and steel toe shoes to this woman, which probably would have been quite unaffordable in 1943?
I would imagine that probably would have been part of it, yes, because they all had the same uniform, so I would imagine, yes, yeah. That was part of their responsibility.
I would love for you to talk about the writing of the book. You got all the history, but did it start with a short story? Did it start, what was your inspiration? How long did it take? And did you massage the characters along the way? Just more about the process.
Well, I knew I wanted to write a women's empowerment story, almost like a leadership parable. And then someone told me, don't describe it like that, because that's really boring. So but in the end, it is what it became. So I knew I wanted to write something like that, and then the pieces kind of fell into place. So there are, one thing I did not intend, I think I've been very transparent about this, is that I was a little bit nervous to write a story with a Black protagonist and a white protagonist, and at the point of view, it alternates between the two, because I did not want to be accused of appropriation or anything like that. So when I thought of Cora and some of the ways she might have reacted, it was knowing that a lot of times she was sort of the token in the room. And as a woman, that's not hard for me to imagine. I was happened in my job situation, happens a lot of places. So that was sort of a common thread for that. And so Cora actually started out with, I took a class at Charlotte Lit. Everyone knows the Charlotte Center for Literary Arts. It's right off Central Avenue in Plaza Wood. And it's a wonderful resource. If anyone wants to write a book, a lot of people do. I would highly recommend their Authors Lab program. So that was the perfect way for me to learn the art of writing fiction. And so it was the entire year of 2019. I spent one Saturday a month there on the campus of Charlotte Lit, and got some great feedback from a lot of really smart people. And I would pretty much write like a chapter a month for that. So no, this did not start out as a short story. I've never published a short story anywhere. So this is really my very first thing I've ever published. It just happens to be 100,000 words. So that was a great learning period for me. And I started out with 4 points of view. So Cora was always a point of view. Maggie was always a point of view. Leland was a point of view at one point, and Billy was a point of view at one point. And that's the magic of editing, and I had all local editors, which were wonderful. So they did not, editors often will read something and you get a little nervous because they're very famous for killing off characters. Too many characters, too confusing, kill this person off. And I was like, no, I can't have that. So they did not kill off any of my characters, but they did kill off the 2 points of view, and it just became the so I tried to rewrite those chapters. Yes. So Maggie did live in Myers Park, and Cora lived in Brooklyn. So I wanted that dichotomy to kind of play out, and I really fell in love with Brooklyn. This is part of what is in the book. I had the idea right before the Me Too movement hit, before Black Lives Matter hit. I wrote it through all of those before the pandemic. I actually typed the end in quarantine. And so all those things are reflected in the book. Maybe not my intention before I started writing it, but I definitely took the things that I learned, and I absolutely fell in love with Brooklyn. It was, as I was here last month, we were talking about Brooklyn. I had no idea that it was 1,400 homes and 250 businesses. So it was a very wonderful partnership.
And Brooklyn was the African-American neighborhood that was demolished in what was called urban renewal in the 1960s. The government center is part of that land today. So thank you for covering that story as well. There is a map up here of Charlotte circa 1940. Come up and find that. Meredith, Fidel, Ritchie, give her a round of applause. Stick out and be at the signing table, and Linda Weisbrook is going to say a last word or two here and point us towards next year when we'll be doing more of this.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Meredith, for a wonderful presentation. Let's give them another round. I want to give some special thanks to the Rosalie Reynolds Explorer History Committee, Tom, of course, and Pamela May, who's sitting in the first row. She was responsible for connecting us to Meredith, and so thank you. What a wonderful connection. Also Ben Benson, Coco Killian, Mike Blair, and the irreplaceable staff at the mansions, Morgan and Morgan Powers. So that's a wrap for 2022. We've already started working on 2023, and we hope to have a presentation probably in the early spring. In the meantime, have a wonderful holiday, and we'll see you next year. Thank
They were gonna just conquer next weekend. That was great.